Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So I'm here this morning with Ayya Soma, and my name is Bhante Suddhaso, and this morning we'll be talking a bit about one of the discourses from the Anguttara Nikaya. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this morning we'll be looking at the Vipallasa Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, sutta number 49, which I believe is translated as distortions or inversions. So the word Vipallasa, again, it means a distortion or inversion or reversal of something. So I'll start by looking at the Pali text, and then Ayya Soma and I will say some words about how to understand or relate to this discourse. So the discourse begins. This is presumably the Buddha speaking. It says, Chattaro me bhikkhave sanya vipallasa, chitta vipallasa, ditti vipallasa. So the Buddha says, monks, there are these four sanya vipallasa. So sanya is perception or identification, so the way we identify things. So sanya vipallasa means a distortion or inversion or reversal of perception, of how we identify what we're seeing. Chitta vipallasa, so chitta is mind. So again, an inverted or distorted mind. And ditti vipallasa, ditti means our viewpoints, our perspectives, our beliefs, our opinions. So again, an inversion or distortion of our viewpoints, our way of seeing the world. It says katame chattaro, so what for? The first one says, aniche bhikkhave nichanti sanya vipallaso chitta vipallaso ditti vipallaso. So it says aniche. So in regards to that which is impermanent, one has the distorted view that it is nicca, that it is permanent. So things which are unstable, impermanent, insubstantial, we regard them as stable, as permanent, as substantial. Next he says, dukkhe bhikkhave sukhanti sanya vipallaso chitta vipallaso ditti vipallaso. So regarding that which is dukkha, that which is unsatisfying, that which is incapable of providing happiness. So we see it as sukha. So that which is unsatisfying, we see it as satisfying. That which is painful, we see it as pleasant. And then he says, anattani bhikkhave attati sanya vipallaso chitta vipallaso ditti vipallaso. So regarding that which is not self, we regard it as self. So this also is a inversion or distortion of perception of our mind, of our viewpoints. And then the fourth one, he says, asubhe bhikkhave subhanti sanya vipallaso chitta vipallaso ditti vipallaso. So regarding that which is asubha, non-beautiful, we regard it as subha, as beautiful. So this is another distortion of mind. So we're talking about this yesterday here at the monastery, how we project the concept of beauty onto things, when actually everything is not beautiful or ugly. It just is whatever it is, but we project the concept of beauty onto it. So this is what the Buddha is talking here as a distortion of perception, is we, regarding that which is non-beautiful, we project the perception of beauty. And then the Buddha gives the opposite. He says, Chattaro me bhikkhave na sanya vipallasa, na chitta vipallasa, na ditti vipallasa. So he says there are these 4 non-distortions or non-inversions of perception, of mind, of views. In what for? And so he says, aniche bhikkhave anichanti. So to see that which is impermanent as impermanent. Dukkhe dukhanti, to see that which is dukkha as unsatisfying, to see it as unsatisfying. Anattani anattati, so to see that which is non-self as not-self. And asubhe asubhanti, so to see that which is non-beautiful as non-beautiful. So the Buddha says, Emeko bhikkhave chattaro na sanya vipallasa, na chitta vipallasa, na ditti vipallasa. So these are the 4 non-inversions or non-distortions of perception, of mind, and of view. Then after this, there's a poem, but maybe we can talk about the body of the sutta before we look at the poem. Okay.
Sure.
So maybe Ayya Soma, would you like to share some thoughts about this sutta so far?
Sure. Thank you, Bhante, for that beautiful translation. And yeah, this is one of my favorite suttas, although I'm not credible anymore because I always say it whenever there is a sutta. But yeah, it's just so to the point, so beautifully. The Buddha essentially highlights the predicament that we're constantly in, and offers some very useful ways to actually start trying to actually cultivate right view by understanding how distorted our perception of reality is to begin with. So understanding how essentially we, just how, sometimes we can take things for being in a different way than they are, or sometimes like we can actually overhear something and we think that a person said something else, and then we figure out that we're wrong. So we kind of get it in this worldly way. But there's some other things that instead we have all these dogmas in our minds that we never even question. And so our experience of reality is always distorted. It's always this essentially experience of permanence, until we actually die. We still, it's always this kind of abstract thing where we're kind of like, yeah, I'm sure I'm going to die, but not today, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow. And yes, of course, everybody that I love and I care about are going to die, but not today, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow. And then when it happens, that's why we're shocked, because we have to come to terms essentially with reality, with how things are. And this is, applies also to our health. Maybe we're in good health, and then at a certain point, that good health is not there anymore. And we're like, wait, how is it possible? I thought this had been here all along, or old age and so forth, like everything. If we really reflect on our perception of just basically how we go about in the world, and how we really, if we're really truly honest with ourselves, how, we are really clinging to this idea of permanence. And also to this idea of personalizing everything. Like we're constantly like, blaming people or even superior beings. Even if we have a faith in God, for example, how many times do we hear actually people or ourselves blaming God for things that happen to ourselves, right? Or even blaming someone for if the train is late or if we get stuck in traffic. So we tend to take things that are clearly impersonal as personal. There's always like some sort of kind of conspiracy against against us. And and not understanding really how, for example, having someone very dear to us. Is we tend to think like, for example, falling in love or really having, these close relationships with people or with sentient beings is a cause of sukha, but instead is a cause of dukkha. Not, of course, the cultivation of a mind of loving kindness or loving friendliness. Of course, not that, but definitely the attachment that comes with wanting then also the people that we care about, the sentient beings that we care about, to be constantly permanent. Or maybe sometimes not to change in the way that we want them to change. So all of that attachment that we build up, but we think that's the cause of sukha. I think we were talking about last week, maybe even of falling in love, of how we tend to, I remember back in it's not the good old days, it's the bad old days, prior to becoming a monastic. And one of the hindrances that I had in taking this form was, this sort of being in love with being in love. So even though, I wasn't in a relationship at the time, there was kind of like in the back of my head, oh, but it was just so beautiful, like every time I was in a relationship, or actually not even when I was in a relationship, but the falling in love, that's just so lovely and beautiful. And then as my practice kept on really developing, I started having this grasp, this real understanding of actually the unpleasantness of infatuation, the unpleasantness of having all of those strong emotions. So the idea in the mind was very different from the actual experience. And so this is actually something very powerful when we start realizing how that distortion comes into being, and that prevents us from actually seeing the reality of things. It's like, I still remember while doing mindfulness of the body, or rather mindfulness of emotions, that then turns into really experiencing the emotions in the body and having that direct experience of, this is quite unsettling. This is quite, yeah, it's not really sukha. It's actually very dukkha. And so we see that, it's a little bit different than what we think it is. And ultimately, of course, how we at the very beginning, we're like, how is it possible the Buddha says that, we're actually, that what is attractive is actually unattractive? How is it possible? I think this is pretty attractive. This is beautiful. This is the way it is. But then, if we really look into what is it that we actually think is pretty, what is that? And if we have an aging parent, it's very easy to see that, especially if the parent was really beautiful. My mom was very beautiful when she was young. She still is in her own way, but she's 80 and she's suffering a lot, actually, that every time she looks at herself in the mirror, she expresses her distress. And there's also pretty much the body that is falling apart into pieces. And that is something that I can relate even more, and saying, wow, actually also my body, maybe I'm half her age. I'm not exactly 80 years old yet, but there's a sense that there's some beauty still in this body. But actually, when I look at it deeply with the sort of wisdom that comes when actually understanding the predicament that my mom is in, like, it's actually not really that great. Even when we go to the bathroom, it's actually inside this body, it's pretty gross. So we start having a bit of a fuller picture of what exactly we're dealing with, and how our body is not different from other people's bodies, and so forth. So these are just a few reflections that come to mind. I don't know if you want to. And of course, you're welcome to write any questions or comments.
Well, I think that Actually, Ayya Soma gave a really complete summary of this discourse. So I might just add a little bit. So first off, pointing out that these are, first off, it's the three characteristics which we're used to because these appear in many places in the suttas. So anicca, dukkha, anatta, which all throughout the suttas, the Buddha speaks about as being the basis of insight, the basis of liberating wisdom, is to see the world in terms of anicca, dukkha, anatta. Because this is, again, it's what goes directly counter to our core delusions. What makes this list a little bit different is that the Buddha here includes this fourth characteristic of asubha. So anicca, dukkha, anatta, asubha. So this inclusion of, again, targeting the concept of beauty, as we were talking about earlier. And this is actually really, really notable in that, for example, if one looks at, well, you can see it among humans, actually. So one person finds another person beautiful, and then somebody else sees the same person and finds them uninteresting or even repulsive. And vice versa. So different people have different perceptions of beauty, different ideas about what they consider to be beautiful. And it becomes even more so when we consider cross species. Like you look at gorillas or something, and there's no sense of beauty, but another gorilla sees another gorilla, and there's a sense of attraction, of beauty, of appreciation. So noticing how, again, it's something which is generated by the mind. So beauty is not something that's inherent in the object, but rather it's a fabrication of our own mind. And noticing how it's also invariably, it comes from a delusion. It comes from a alteration of our actual experience. So this is often quite noticeable. So Ayya Soma was talking about falling in love. So it's often quite noticeable when one falls in love with another person. There's that initially the person seems so radiant and beautiful and flawless and perfect. But then after a few weeks, then you start to notice like, oh, there's these little wrinkles around their eyes, and their laughter is just a little bit too high pitched, and the way they walk, they kind of walk in a little bit ungraceful way, and the mind starts like noticing the different unbeautiful aspects of the person. And you notice like, oh, and then they're always a little bit grumpy early in the morning, and also in the afternoon, and also in the evening, and they're actually not that nice to me. I mean, they're nice, but not like super nice. And so the mind starts noticing the flaws and imperfections, the unbeautiful things about that person. But those things were there all along. So it's not like they actually were this radiantly perfect godlike being when you first met them, and then they developed these unbeautiful traits as time went by. But those unbeautiful traits were there from the very beginning. But because of our distortion of perception, we weren't noticing it. Because of our distortion of perception, we were only seeing the qualities of that person, which would reinforce the perception of beauty. And the mind was quite literally ignoring or erasing the experiences which would contradict our belief in beauty, which would contradict our belief in our perception of beauty in that person. So like you remember back to those first few days, and yeah, those first few days, the person had no wrinkles by their eyes, and their laughter was exactly the right pitch, and they were always so kind. And but that's just a distortion of mind. It's because that's what we wanted to believe. So our mind rewrites our experience to match what we want things to be. And this is Ditti Vipallasa. And Ditti, so the Buddha here, he talks about these three varieties of Vipallasa. So Sanya Vipallasa is the distortion of perception. So it's how we, actually how we identify things. Chitta Vipallasa is distortion of mind, so how we think about things. And Ditti Vipallasa is distortion of view. So distortion of our opinions, our perspectives on things. So Sanya Vipallasa, again, it's like you look at the person and you identify them as perfect or flawless. You think about them and you think about them as being this wonderful, radiant being. And Ditti Vipallasa, so we have this, we get stuck on this viewpoint of the person as being beautiful, as being perfect, as being flawless. But all of this is a fabrication of the mind. It's a fabrication of the mind, which we then project upon reality. And you can only keep that up for so long. Eventually, that distortion starts to break down because we see that it's contrary to our actual experience. But the Buddha is saying that we're actually doing this all the time. So in these 4 ways. So with the delusion of permanence, the delusion of pleasure, the delusion of self, and the delusion of beauty. So these 4 delusions or inversions of mind that we're constantly projecting on the world and believing in them. And because this is our habit, it takes a lot of work to redirect the mind. So the mind's been going full speed in the wrong direction for countless lifetimes. So it's going to take a bit of effort getting it to turn around and start going in the right direction. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to add to this. And I see there's a couple questions. Maybe we can have a look at the questions.
Sure.
So, well, first off, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Richard, Jayanta, Manal, Matthias, Gita, Morgana, Dharmasiri, Christina, Bhumika, Harshi, Avis, Sud, other Gita, Julie, Mark, Miguel, Sajita, Janaki, who was just here at the monastery. Hello, Janaki. Salvatore, is this our Salvatore from? Oh, from wonderful. Hello, Salvatore. So wonderful to see all of you joining in. And there's a question here. So Christina says, and why the inversion of perception? Ayya, Soma?
Well, I think you were addressing that, so maybe Bhante, you want to.
Well, I'm not sure why what exactly you're asking. Are you asking why do we have this inversion of perception in the first place? Or are you asking why is the word translated as inversion? So maybe if you can be a bit more clear about what you mean when you say why the inversion of perception. If you're asking why it's present in the first place, well, the truth is that delusion has no discoverable beginning. So we have these inversions of perceptions because we've had them literally forever. So there's no starting point to be found. What is important is that there is an ending point that can be found if we direct the mind towards it. So it's possible to break these habits of inverted perception if we want to. But as for why it's there in the first place, well, actually, the Buddha said that's the wrong question. So asking why is the mind inverted, that's the wrong question. The right question is, how can we turn it right side up? Asking why it's inverted is completely useless. It's not actually a useful question. The useful question is, how can we reverse the reversal? How can we get it upright again? Or get it upright in the first place? And there's another question here. Mark says, your mama is beautiful. So that's Subhasanya, which is
bless your
sweet.
heart, Mark.
Yeah. But actually, this is also another element of Buddhist practice. So we normally, we talk about Buddhist practice in many different ways, but one of our practices is actually the Subha Nimitta practices. So, for example, loving kindness meditation. It's actually cultivating a positive attitude towards all beings. But that's not a distortion or a delusion of mind, but rather it's a deliberate cultivation of a beautiful state of mind. So that's something which is actually training the mind to see all beings as worthy, to see all beings as worthy of respect, worthy of kindness, worthy of appreciation, worthy of generosity, worthy of being treated well. So these are important qualities of mind that we cultivate in Buddhist practice. So it's true, her mama is beautiful. Yeah. And Sud says, how does development of samadhi play into development of seeing anicca, dukkha, anatta? Also, can you please kindly clarify how development of wholesome states of mind helps develop insight? Ayya, Soma.
Yeah, well, simply put, samadhi stabilizes the mind, hence we are capable of seeing things more clearly. So it's no different than having, how do you call the thing to see far away? Binoculars. Binoculars. Yes, like if we have the binoculars and we have to see something that we can't, kind of clearly see, if we're shaking it, well, we're still going to see something, but it's going to be pretty blurry. But if we keep it there focused and still, we're going to have a clear knitted image. So you can somewhat draw the parallels. The more our mind is shaky, the more we're going to be confused, and the more the harder we'll have a time to actually see the characteristics of everything that we're experiencing. And in terms of clarifying how development of wholesome states help develop insight, well, you can think of greed, hatred, and delusion as sort of dyes through which, we have water by its nature is clear and limpid. And basically, as we put these dyes in it, even one drop of one color will taint the whole water, right? So the more we develop the opposite, so we remove essentially, we remove the dyes. We remove the things that color the water. So the more we develop, for example, the mind of loving kindness, the more we uproot the conditions for the dye of hatred to come and taint the mind. Hence, makes it easier to see through a transparent water rather than through a tainted water.
And Mark says, how do I see beyond the flaws in myself so I don't see them in others? Well, I think first it's important actually to acknowledge our own flaws, but also to acknowledge our own good traits. And actually the Buddha said it's important to devote time to recollecting our own goodness, recollecting our own virtues, our own generosity, our own kindness, recollecting whatever wholesome traits we've developed. So actually deliberately drawing our attention to appreciating our own good qualities. And as for being aware of our flaws, well, it is important to be aware of what's there so that we know what to do, we know what to work on, we know what to improve. But at the same time, also being very forgiving of ourselves. So aware of our flaws and aware of why they're there, aware of the conditions which lead to the development of not so nice qualities of mind or not so nice qualities of heart. Because when we see within ourselves how these things come into being, then that actually makes it easier to be forgiving of them in others. So, for example, it's easy to be like, God, he's not really that nice to me. He's a little bit grumpy. Like, what's wrong with this person? And we look at our own mind and we're like, oh, wait, actually, I'm a little bit grumpy in the morning when I haven't had enough tea and I haven't had enough sleep and I've got a headache. I'm a little bit irritable too. Maybe it's actually not that he's a bad person. Maybe it's just that he's sometimes has a hard time, just like I sometimes have a hard time. So it's not always easy for me to be bright and cheerful and friendly 24/7. So of course it's not easy for other people to be bright and cheerful and friendly 24/7. Or you notice how your mind can slip into greed. And you find you've actually Ajahn Chah gave the example of you have two apples, one that's a little bit like bigger and riper and another one that's a little bit smaller and less desirable. And you're like, which one am I going to give to my friend? Like the bigger, nicer one or the smaller, less nice one? And you're like, I should really give my friend the big, nice apple. No, I'm going to keep it for myself. And you give them the small one instead. So it's like, okay, yeah, of course. Of course, we're going to be a little bit greedy and selfish sometimes because we're not enlightened yet. And these habits of greed are very strong and it's very hard to counteract them. So seeing our own flaws, then when we see other people around us being a little bit greedy and self-centered, we're like, oh, of course. Of course. Of course, people are going to be like that sometimes because it's really difficult. It's really difficult to retrain the mind. We've spent hundreds of lifetimes teaching our mind to be greedy and grumpy. Like, why are we expecting it to switch around overnight? And it's the same with everybody else. Everybody else has spent hundreds of lifetimes being greedy and grumpy. So we can recognize, oh, just like me, they're having a hard time retraining their mind. Oh, poor little buddies. Oh, but I can work on forgiving them for their slip-ups because I also make the same slip-ups. And I'm going to try to be better because I don't like it when other people are greedy and grumpy, so I should try to be a little bit nicer myself as well. So actually, I think that recognizing one's own flaws in this kind of gentle, forgiving, understanding way then makes it easier to be forgiving and understanding of the flaws in others. Ayya, Soma, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I think covered it all.
Okay. And Sud asks, so is the whole point of developing metta to develop samadhi in order to see clearly what is going on?
I would say that metta is useful to develop sila, samadhi, and panya. So pretty much you can't go wrong with metta. Definitely, it's a very skillful tool to develop also samadhi. As a matter of fact, if you actually have an easy time developing metta, that can be a way to really focus your mind and develop it further. And ultimately, all of Buddhist practice is aimed at seeing things the way they actually are. So yeah, metta is a big ace. How do you say aso in la manica? Like a big
Ace in the hole.
ace in the hole.
Is that what we say?
Ace in the hole.
Ace in the hole.
Or ace in the sleeve.
We
Ace
say
up the sleeve.
ace in the sleeve.
Ace up your sleeve.
Ace up your sleeve.
Ace up your sleeve. There you go.
Yeah.
Asso nella manica, Nitan. All right.
And that's the last question from
But we
online.
still have this part of the sutta that we
can go through it. It doesn't really add any new information. It's more a summary. So then there's this poem that the Buddha ends with. So he says, Anicca nicca sanino, dukkha cha sukha sanino, anatta nicca attati, asubhe subhasanino. So he says, for those who perceive the impermanent as permanent, the unsatisfying as pleasant, the impersonal as personal, the non-beautiful as beautiful. He says, Micca ditti hata satta, so beings who are afflicted by wrong view, struck by wrong view. Kitta citta visanyano, so whose minds are deranged. and whose perception is inverted, reversed. He says, Te yoga yuta marasa. He says they are bound by Mara. So they're caught by the deceiver. Ayoga ke minojana. He says these people are not, they're not free. They're not free from entrapment. Sattaga chanti sangsarang jati maranagamino. It says, and these beings will continue to move through samsara, so moving through birth and death, the cycle of birth and death. He says, Jiracha Buddha lokasming upajanti pabankara. And he says, but when a Buddha arises in the world, the pabankara means the bringer of light, the maker of light. He says, Teyamang dhammang pakasanti duku pasamagaminang. He says, and they teach the Dhamma to the world, which leads to the ending of dukkha. Actually, interestingly enough, here the word Buddha is plural. So when Buddhas arise in the world, and when they teach the Dhamma, when those Buddhas teach the Dhamma. It says, Te sang sudvana sapanya sachitang pachaladate. And the Buddha says, and when wise people hear that, then they regain their own mind. They regain their right mind. And he says, Anichang anichito dakung. So they see the impermanent as impermanent. Dukkang adakku dukkuto. They see dukkha as dukkha. Anattani anattati. They see the impersonal as impersonal. Asubang asubadat as adasung. They see the non-beautiful as non-beautiful. Sammaditi samadana. So taking up right view. Sabang dukkang upachugunti. They reach the transcendence of all dukkha. So again, just a short verse summarizing the main point of the sutta. Any comments on the verses?
Thank you, Bhante. No, simply I like the part where the Buddha essentially tells us, points out, highlights how we get stuck in samsara. And keep on just rolling into this wheel, and how what a blessing it is to find the Dhamma that actually explains to us how we are stuck in this predicament and how also we can get out of it. But it's very important also to understand absolutely how we are stuck in it and how we keep on getting stuck in it. And it's not that someone else is locking us up and throws away the key and that's it. But rather there's something that we're actually doing in order to keep being entrapped. And so we can just stop doing what we're doing. But we need to understand that we're doing it in the first place. So I feel like, that's the most precious thing that the Buddha does. It really highlights all of this process and then tells us a way out. And there's so many different things that we can develop in order to fully realize essentially our distortions and basically make them right, make them not distorted anymore.
Yeah, and I don't see any more questions. So maybe that's a good point to end for the morning. So this evening you can join us for our weekly mug chat. So you can bring all the questions that you have related to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And we can conclude this morning session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.